is a bill that will give the president discretion to apply secondary tariffs on sanctioned Russian oil.
In a major turn of events, tensions between the U.S. and China have reached a boiling point. The U.S. government is scrambling to secure $100 billion in critical funding, but China has made it clear they're not backing down. As the two global giants face off, this unprecedented economic standoff raises questions about the future of global trade, security, and power dynamics. How will the U.S. respond to this rejection? What will it mean for the world's economy and international relations? Do you think China made the right decision in rejecting the U.S. demands? Comment 1 if you agree, or 0 if you think the U.S. should have been granted what they asked for. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Let's dive deep into this explosive story. The new tariff legislation on Russian oil, which the U.S. government is considering, could have far-reaching effects not only on the U.S. economy, but also on international relations, particularly with China. This legislation would grant the U.S. president the authority to impose secondary tariffs on Russian oil that has been sanctioned, with tariffs potentially reaching as high as 500%. This is a bold move aimed at increasing pressure on countries that continue to purchase Russian oil, especially China, a nation with extensive trade relations with Russia. The global oil market is currently facing significant changes. The U.S. has proposed further sanctions on Russia, but China has no intention of changing its policy of purchasing oil from Russia. China continues to assert that the choice of oil suppliers is a matter of national sovereignty and refuses any outside interference. Despite repeated calls from the U.S. for China to stop purchasing oil from Russia, China's refusal to back down has intensified tensions between the two superpowers. One of the critical factors to consider is the impact of this tariff legislation on the U.S. economy. If the tariffs are increased as planned, it could lead to rising oil prices, which would drive up production costs and the prices of goods domestically. Businesses that rely on oil imports would face higher operating costs, which would directly affect U.S. consumers. They would have to pay more for gasoline, consumer goods, and even services due to increased transportation costs. On the other hand, if this tariff legislation is passed, the U.S. could use it as a strategic tool to pressure other nations, particularly China, to stop purchasing oil from Russia. However, this move not only risks escalating political tensions but could also harm international trade relations. This may lead China to seek alternative oil supplies from other regions, thereby significantly altering the dynamics of the global energy market. Additionally, the development of renewable energy and clean technologies could play a crucial role in helping the U.S. mitigate the negative impacts of dependence on imported oil. As nations shift toward greater use of renewable energy, the demand for oil will decrease, thereby reducing reliance on oil-exporting countries like Russia. This tariff legislation also provides an important lesson on how tariffs can serve as a powerful tool in foreign policy and economic strategy. The U.S. government is attempting to use tariffs to pressure nations and change their behavior, but this approach carries significant risks. The international community may retaliate with countermeasures, leading to heightened tensions and potentially triggering a global trade war. Moreover, the uncertainty surrounding energy markets will impact financial markets, causing considerable volatility. Another key takeaway is the challenge of balancing domestic economic interests with international relations. This legislation will create a difficult situation for the U.S. How to protect the domestic economy without damaging international trade relations, especially with partners like China. If this strategy is not executed carefully, it could have long-term consequences for both the U.S. economy and its trade partners. Finally, the impact of this tariff legislation goes beyond oil and money. It reflects a shift in the U.S.'s approach to its relations with other countries, particularly as the world moves away from fossil fuel dependency toward renewable energy. The U.S. may face even more challenges if it wishes to maintain its influence in shaping global energy and trade policies in the future. From the analysis above, it can be concluded that this tariff policy is an ambitious strategy by the U.S. to influence other nations and create changes in global trade practices. However, it also carries numerous risks, from political tensions to negative effects on the economy. The success of this strategy will depend on the U.S. government's ability to balance domestic interests with international relationships and minimize unintended consequences. Tariffs and current energy policies are having widespread effects not only on the countries involved, but also on consumers' daily lives, particularly in places like China and the United States. The greatest challenge consumers face today is the rise in the cost of living, which is directly influenced by tariff policies, especially in the oil industry, which impacts many sectors of the economy. Washington has repeatedly urged Beijing to stop purchasing oil from Russia and Iran, instead switching to U.S. oil. However, China maintains that the choice of energy suppliers is a matter of national sovereignty. In response, China has imposed a 100% tariff on Russian oil, a strong move aimed at protecting its energy policy autonomy. This clearly demonstrates Beijing's unwillingness to compromise, reflecting the tension between the two largest economies in the world. For consumers in China, filling up a gas tank could be 3 or 4 times cheaper compared to switching to U.S. oil. This price gap reflects a stark difference between domestic energy prices and the cost of energy imports from the U.S. With cheaper oil from Russia and Iran, China not only saves money for its citizens, but also for industries that depend on energy, particularly transportation. Transport companies in China could save thousands of dollars a month by using inexpensive oil, which allows them to keep transportation costs low and maintain reasonable prices for consumers. However, if China decides to compromise and switch to U.S. oil, this would create a major shock for Chinese consumers. Energy costs would rise significantly, and people would face higher gasoline and oil prices. Transport companies would also be strongly affected, as they would have to pay more for fuel, which could lead to higher prices for goods and services. On the other hand, for American consumers, this shift would directly affect domestic prices. If the U.S. decides to increase oil exports to China, this could reduce domestic oil supply, pushing prices even higher. Consumers would bear the brunt of rising energy prices, as gasoline, oil, and related products could all see price hikes. Additionally, businesses would face higher costs, and this could put further pressure on the U.S. economy, especially amid the ongoing inflation issue. However, the impact is not limited to fuel prices alone. Changing energy supplies also affects other industries, particularly those reliant on energy for production and transportation of goods. Factories, transport companies, and service industries would need to adjust their strategies to cope with the rising energy costs, and this could lead to price increases for products and services. Consumers, especially those with lower or middle incomes, will feel the most significant negative impacts of these changes. As tariff and energy policies continue to evolve, it is clear that consumers bear the heaviest burden. The decisions made by major countries like the U.S. and China not only affect the global economy but also place significant pressure on household budgets. Governments must carefully weigh the long-term economic benefits against the short-term impacts on the citizens. Therefore, the major lesson to be learned from this situation is that dependence on imported energy can lead to significant instability in the economy, especially when international policies change. Consumers will always face price fluctuations, and protecting the interests of the people is a key factor that countries must consider when making tariff and energy policy decisions. U.S. oil production reached 13.49 million barrels per day in May, a remarkable figure reflecting the strong growth of the American oil industry. However, despite this impressive production level, U.S. oil exports still face significant challenges, particularly when it comes to transportation costs and competition from cheaper oil supplies from Russia and Iran. One of the main reasons U.S. crude oil faces difficulties in export is the long shipping routes and high logistical costs. To move oil from production areas in the West and Gulf of Mexico to international markets, the U.S. needs to rely on complex and expensive shipping routes. This not only increases export costs, but also makes U.S. crude oil less competitive compared to other oil sources from countries like Russia and Iran, which can offer cheaper oil thanks to lower production and transportation costs. Another important factor affecting the competitiveness of U.S. crude oil is the strong development of energy industries in other countries, particularly Russia and Iran. These countries provide cheap oil, giving them a significant advantage in large oil-consuming markets such as Asia, where the demand for oil is high. Russian and Iranian oil is often cheaper, allowing these nations to more easily compete with U.S. crude oil in export contracts, particularly for countries looking to cut energy costs. Meanwhile, the U.S.'s lack of trade agreements with many large nations could further complicate its oil export efforts. Although the U.S. has worked to increase oil exports in recent years, factors such as political barriers, tariffs, and trade agreements may hinder access to key markets. Asia, particularly China and India, represents a large potential market for oil, but challenges from political issues and price competition from other suppliers make it more difficult for U.S. oil to break into this region. Additionally, the global development of renewable energy is gradually reducing dependence on traditional oil, affecting the long-term growth prospects of the U.S. oil industry. As more countries shift towards clean energy and reduce reliance on oil, demand for U.S. crude oil may be impacted in the future, particularly in markets transitioning to renewable energy, such as Europe and some countries in Asia. In conclusion, while U.S. oil production is at a record high, the challenges in exporting remain a significant hurdle. High transportation costs, competition from cheap Russian and Iranian oil, political factors, and the transition to renewable energy all create a challenging environment for the U.S. oil industry. To maintain competitiveness and sustainable growth, the U.S. will need to find solutions to overcome these difficulties, including improving transportation infrastructure and developing export strategies that align with the changing global energy demands. The U.S. shale oil industry has proven to be a crucial part of the global energy economy, particularly as the U.S. has become one of the largest oil producers in the world. However, like many industries, shale oil faces significant challenges when oil prices fluctuate, and the impact of falling oil prices can have severe consequences on employment and production operations. One key factor is the sensitivity of the shale oil industry to changes in oil prices. If crude oil prices drop by as little as $5 per barrel, the U.S. shale oil industry could face a major crisis. This not only affects the profitability of oil companies, but also threatens thousands of jobs in the industry. Whenever oil prices fall, shale oil companies may be forced to cut costs, leading to the closure of drilling rigs and the firing of hundreds of workers. These workers are primarily employed in shale oil production regions, where low oil prices may render drilling operations economically unfeasible. This issue is particularly important because shale oil production is different from traditional oil extraction methods. Shale oil requires significant investment in drilling and extraction. When oil prices drop, drilling rigs become less profitable, and in many cases, oil companies lack the financial incentive to continue extraction activities. Furthermore, when oil prices decline, shale oil producers typically face higher production costs than traditional oil producers, as shale oil extraction requires more complex technology and higher operating costs. This can lead to companies reducing production scale or closing unprofitable rigs. The decline in oil prices also has a negative impact on oilfield service companies. These companies, which provide services such as well drilling, rig maintenance, or oil transportation, will see their revenues sharply decline when shale oil companies cut back on operations. Thousands of workers in these service companies could lose their jobs, creating a ripple effect throughout related industries such as manufacturing, logistics, and support services. Additionally, the layoffs can have lasting negative effects on local communities where shale oil development is concentrated. Areas such as Texas, North Dakota, and Oklahoma, which host numerous shale oil rigs, would face rising unemployment and declining incomes, affecting the economies of small towns and rural communities. While oil companies may try to optimize operations to minimize damage, falling oil prices remain a significant challenge. When revenue from shale oil decreases, companies will have to make difficult decisions about whether to continue drilling operations or halt them to reduce financial losses. While some companies may be able to sustain operations thanks to financial stability or the implementation of new technology to reduce costs, many smaller companies and newer shale oil producers will not be able to withstand these shocks. The lesson from this situation highlights that, although the U.S. shale oil industry has achieved impressive milestones in recent years, it still depends heavily on fluctuations in global oil prices. When oil prices fall, Even this robust energy industry cannot escape serious consequences. Employment in the shale oil industry, although it may recover when oil prices rise again, remains vulnerable to job losses and unpredictable fluctuations. This serves as a warning about the instability of energy industries that are dependent on prices and unpredictable market factors. The trade war between the United States and China, with the U.S. imposing tariffs on imports from China, has had far-reaching effects on the global economy, particularly for American consumers. High tariffs, reaching triple-digit percentages on a wide range of consumer products imported from China, have not only raised the prices of goods, but have also directly impacted the daily lives of U.S. citizens. This has created a chain reaction, increasing the cost of living and putting pressure on household budgets. One of the most noticeable effects faced by U.S. consumers is the rise in prices of popular consumer products. For example, a washing machine that used to cost around $500 now may increase to $600 or $620 due to the new tariffs. This price increase is not limited to washing machines, but extends to other consumer electronics like laptops, TVs, and household appliances. It is estimated that the price of these products could increase by $50 to $80, which is a significant amount for many families. This cost increase is mainly a result of the U.S. imposing high tariffs on goods imported from China, a country that provides a large portion of consumer products to the U.S. When companies that manufacture and sell these goods face higher tariffs, they pass the cost burden onto consumers, leading to higher prices. American consumers, who have been accustomed to buying quality products at affordable prices from China, will now have to spend more on everyday items they use. The tariffs not only impact household products, but also affect many other sectors, from clothing to electronics. Imported goods from China make up a large portion of the consumer products in the U.S., and the increase in tariffs means these items will become more expensive. This may force families to adjust their budgets, cutting back on discretionary spending, which will ultimately affect their quality of life. It is not only consumers who are affected, but businesses also face significant challenges. Companies that import products from China will experience higher production costs, forcing them to adjust their prices as well. This will not only affect retail companies, but also manufacturers who rely on imported raw materials and components from China to complete their products. As production costs rise, companies will have little choice but to increase their product prices to maintain profits. Moreover, one of the unavoidable consequences of tariffs is the disruption of global supply chains. Companies in the U.S. may struggle to maintain a steady supply from China, which could lead to product shortages and increased prices due to supply constraints. Businesses might need to find alternative sources from other countries, but this transition is not easy and will be more costly, further increasing expenses. While President Trump expressed hope that the tariffs would encourage domestic manufacturing and reduce dependence on Chinese imports, the reality shows that this has not only increased consumer costs, but also created a series of issues for the economy. One of the key lessons from this situation is that trade wars affect not only the countries involved, but also directly impact consumers, increasing the cost of living and creating tensions in the economy. In conclusion, the imposition of tariffs on goods imported from China has had a noticeable impact on U.S. consumers, with the prices of essential consumer products rising. This has not only reduced consumers' purchasing power, but also created negative effects on businesses and the overall economy. As the trade war continues, more issues may arise, threatening the stability of the economy and the lives of American citizens. If you agree with the impacts of tariffs and this trade war on U.S. consumers, comment 1 below this video. If you disagree, leave 0 and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to share this video so your friends can understand more about the current situation, and subscribe to support us in bringing more interesting updates. Stay tuned for further developments. While the U.S. has implemented strong tariff measures against China in an effort to reduce the trade deficit and protect the domestic economy, the country still faces significant financial challenges at home. One of the main issues is the growing budget deficit and rising public debt. Recently, the U.S. government had to announce a record-breaking $100 billion four-year Treasury bond auction to raise funds, aiming to alleviate pressure on long-term interest rates and maintain national financial stability. The issuance of such large-scale Treasury bonds is a strategy to ensure the government has sufficient resources to finance public spending and maintain economic stability. However, this move also carries some major risks. The first risk is the demand from investors. If the auction does not attract enough interest from investors, it could result in higher bond interest rates, meaning the government's borrowing costs would increase. This situation would not only affect the government but also extend to households and businesses. As long-term Treasury bond rates rise, the interest rates on personal loans, including mortgages, consumer loans, and student loans, are also likely to increase. This would raise borrowing costs for households, causing them to pay more for loans. For example, if mortgage rates increase, individuals will face higher monthly payments, which could reduce their ability to spend and invest. Meanwhile, businesses would also feel the burden of higher borrowing costs, which could lead them to cut back on investment or even reduce their scale of operations. The U.S. domestic financial situation is further impacted by the need to maintain high public debt levels. In efforts to sustain welfare programs and fund infrastructure projects, the U.S. government continues to borrow money. However, the increasing public debt could create serious financial issues in the future. If the U.S. is unable to maintain financial stability and reduce the budget deficit, borrowing will become more difficult, and borrowing costs will rise. This could lead to a vicious cycle where the government needs to borrow more to pay higher interest rates while cutting essential spending in other areas. Furthermore, the rising cost of borrowing will increase pressure on consumers and domestic businesses. As borrowing costs rise, consumers will have to spend more on personal loans and reduce spending on other items. This could lead to a decrease in consumer demand, negatively impacting economic growth. For businesses, higher borrowing costs could make it difficult to sustain and expand operations, affecting employment and workers' income. The lesson from the current financial situation in the U.S. is that while tariffs and financial strategies may temporarily benefit the protection of domestic production and generate budget revenue, challenges related to public debt, borrowing costs, and national financial stability remain crucial issues. Without effective financial management measures, the risk of a future financial crisis cannot be ruled out. Moreover, as borrowing costs rise, both consumers and businesses will clearly feel the negative impacts on their lives and operations, which could dampen consumer spending and long-term economic growth. The trade tensions between the United States and China are not limited to typical consumer goods, but have extended to strategic industries like rare earth elements, which are crucial for producing advanced technologies. In this context, President Trump has continued to threaten imposing a 100% tariff on imports from China if the country does not increase exports of rare earth magnets, an essential component for industries such as electronics, automotive, and renewable energy. Rare earth elements are indispensable in the production of high-tech products, from smartphones and laptops to electric vehicles and autonomous cars. China currently controls about 80% of global rare earth production, making it the primary supplier to U.S. industries, particularly in technology and automotive sectors. As the main supplier, any disruption in rare earth exports from China could have severe consequences for global supply chains, especially for companies manufacturing electronic components and vehicles in the U.S. The tensions surrounding rare earths not only reflect the intense trade war between the world's two largest economies, but also highlight the critical role these minerals play in maintaining a competitive advantage in technology and manufacturing. If China decides to tighten rare earth exports or even stop them completely, the U.S. would face a serious supply shortage, leading to higher production costs and disrupting key industries. Automotive manufacturers, for instance, would struggle to maintain production of electric vehicles and high-tech vehicles due to the scarcity of rare earth magnets required for efficient motors. This disruption could also affect consumer electronics. Products like smartphones, laptops, TVs, and other electronics all rely on rare earth elements in their manufacturing process. If production costs rise due to supply shortages, companies would be forced to raise prices, which would directly affect consumers. This could lead to soaring prices for technology and electronic products, making it difficult for consumers and reducing the purchasing power of the U.S. market. On the other hand, China's control of 80% of the global rare earth supply also presents a dilemma for U.S. foreign policy and long-term strategic development. In the face of growing trade tensions, the U.S. may need to seek alternative sources from other countries, but this transition is not easy. Building rare earth mining and processing facilities in other nations will take time and require significant investment. Additionally, mining rare earth elements within the U.S. faces environmental challenges and strict natural resource protection requirements. This serves as a reminder that in today's globalized world, strategic resources like rare earths can become key factors in trade wars and geopolitical confrontations. Despite being a powerful economy, the U.S. still depends on supplies from other countries, and China's dominance over the rare earth market poses significant risks to economic and national security. Ultimately, the rare earth trade war not only reflects the tensions in U.S.-China relations, but also opens up a broader debate about supply security and long-term strategies for nations to protect key industries. The U.S. must decide whether to continue escalating tariffs to pressure China or seek to increase domestic rare earth production to reduce dependence on China. The big question is whether this strategy can bring sustainable benefits while ensuring the growth of U.S. technology and automotive industries. The trade tensions between the U.S. and its partner nations, particularly China, have created a range of direct and indirect impacts on the U.S. economy. One of the most noticeable effects has been the rise in the cost of consumer goods, especially those imported from countries subjected to tariffs, including China. The U.S. tariff policy has not only increased the prices of consumer products, but also affected manufacturers and small businesses, creating a financial burden for American consumers. For example, a laptop that cost $1,000 at the beginning of the year could now cost consumers an additional $100 due to the new tariffs. This price increase might not seem significant to some, but for low and middle-income consumers, it represents a considerable added expense. This highlights the pressure that tariff policies place on household budgets, particularly as many people are already coping with rising prices for essential items like food, gasoline, and basic services. Moreover, it's not just consumer products, but also small businesses that are facing difficulties with the increase in import costs. These businesses, which rely on imported materials and components, must find ways to cut costs or raise product prices to offset the rising expenses. This could lead to reduced consumer purchasing power, declining revenues, and possibly even layoffs or scaling back of operations. Small businesses, particularly those in retail and manufacturing, may struggle to survive long-term if this situation persists. Another consequence of increased tariffs is the disruption in supply chains. Imposing tariffs on imported goods from China can slow down the production and distribution process, leading to shortages and longer waiting times for products. This not only affects businesses but also consumers, who may find their favorite products more difficult to find and more expensive. In addition, the rising cost of goods and services could create a psychological effect on consumers. As prices climb, consumers tend to cut back on spending and become more cautious in their purchasing decisions. This reduces overall consumption in the economy, negatively impacting economic growth. Consumer industries will face slow sales, which can reduce profits and potentially lead to job losses in sectors such as manufacturing, retail, and services. Furthermore, price hikes won't only affect imported goods, they could also increase the costs of domestically produced products. Domestic manufacturers, while not directly subjected to tariffs on local materials, still experience the effects of rising production costs. For instance, transportation, raw material, and labor costs may increase as energy prices and operational expenses rise. As a result, consumers will pay higher prices for domestic products, further reducing their ability to spend and impacting their quality of life. The lesson from the current situation is that tariffs and trade policies can have far-reaching impacts, not just on partner nations but also on the domestic economy. Policy decisions affect not only large corporations, but also directly impact small businesses and consumers. Therefore, when considering the implementation of tariffs, the government must carefully weigh their effects on consumer purchasing power and businesses, while also seeking solutions to mitigate these negative consequences. Changes in global oil transactions are causing a significant shift in the international financial system, and the U.S. is facing a major challenge from the declining dominance of the U.S. dollar. Previously, the US dollar was widely used in oil transactions, with most countries and major companies trading oil in dollars, which helped maintain the value of the currency. However, in recent years, countries like China and others have started to abandon the US dollar in oil contracts, opting instead for currencies such as the Chinese yuan or other regional currencies. This shift could cause the US dollar to lose a large portion of its role as the global reserve currency, which would reduce the dollar's value and directly affect the US economy. A weaker dollar means that the cost of imports, from oil to consumer goods, will rise. As the value of the dollar declines, exporting nations will demand more dollars for their products, leading to higher prices for goods imported into the US. One of the most obvious impacts on US consumers is the increased cost of imported goods. Products such as oil, metals, and other consumer goods that are purchased with dollars will become more expensive as the dollar loses value. This will lead to higher gasoline prices, food costs, and electronics, products that rely on imports, putting pressure on household budgets. Companies will face higher production costs, and they may pass these costs on to consumers by increasing product prices. Additionally, a weaker dollar will drive up inflation. As the cost of imports rises, domestic consumer products may also see price increases, reducing people's purchasing power. While inflation may spur economic growth in the short term, if left unchecked, it could diminish the quality of life for consumers, as incomes may not keep pace with rising living costs. Furthermore, the weakening of the dollar could negatively impact US companies operating abroad. These companies, particularly exporters, will see the value of their earnings decrease when converting profits from foreign currencies to dollars. This could reduce their profitability and affect their stock prices, leading to a decline in the personal finances of US investors. The shift in oil transactions and the abandonment of the US dollar by trade partners has raised a serious issue for the future of the US economy and the dollar's standing globally. If this trend continues, the US will face greater challenges in maintaining financial power globally and ensuring domestic economic stability. To address this situation, the US government will need to find ways to maintain and strengthen the role of the dollar, while developing new strategies to cope with changes in the international financial landscape. In conclusion, the decline in the dollar's role in global oil transactions is presenting a significant financial challenge for the US. This not only impacts the purchasing power of American consumers, but also affects the economy as a whole, with rising import costs and potentially higher inflation. Maintaining the strength of the dollar will be crucial for the US to protect financial stability and continue to maintain its global economic position. The shift in economic and trade strategies between the United States and Canada has had a significant impact on both economies, especially as the US increased tariffs on key imports from Canada, such as steel, aluminum, and automobiles. This move comes amid growing trade tensions between the two nations, with the US aiming to reduce its trade deficit and protect domestic industries. However, these decisions have forced Canada to adapt its trade strategies. In response, Canada quickly sought new export markets to reduce its reliance on the US market. The Canadian government implemented a series of measures to protect its economy and domestic manufacturing industry. Expanding trade relations with other countries, particularly partners like China, the European Union, and various Asian nations, has allowed Canada to create new opportunities for economic growth. Notably, Canada signed free trade agreements with many countries to strengthen its export position and minimize the negative impacts of US tariffs. Additionally, the Canadian government has launched programs to support domestic manufacturing, including business loans, technology innovation initiatives, and infrastructure improvements to help local businesses compete better in the global market. These measures have not only maintained Canada's economic stability, but also created conditions for its domestic industries to grow stronger, reducing the impact of US tariffs. However, while Canada has begun seeking alternative markets and implementing measures to support its economy, the impact of US tariffs remains a key factor that needs to be continuously monitored. Although new trade strategies may help reduce dependence on the US, the close economic relationship between the two countries remains crucial, and tariff policies will continue to influence trade flows and Canada's economic development. Thank you for watching today's video. If you found the information helpful, don't forget to hit like, share this video with friends and family so they can also understand the changes in the economic strategies of the US and Canada. Be sure to subscribe to support the channel and receive notifications for upcoming videos. Thanks, and see you in the next video.